So in thinking about elementary school teachers as being our first history teachers, it's very important that we think about these two other keywords, a dominant narrative and a revisionist narrative. Let me start with dominant narrative because that's often the term that we're most familiar with. The dominant narrative, or sort of dominant history, uh, around indigenous education, or rather indigenous peoples, tends to sort of center on Thanksgiving as being a very harmonious celebration between the pilgrims and between indigenous peoples. Although typically the words that's used is either Indian or Native American. And uh, activities in the elementary school sort of include, tracing your hand and making that into a turkey, or putting on a headdress, or eating turkey, and will sort of be very celebratory in nature, and will sort of emphasize the pilgrims having come over for out of escaping religious persecution, and in some way sort of positioning England as this bad country, and the indigenous peoples as sort of very welcoming to the people who were coming over, and the pilgrims as being very peaceful people who sort of simply wanted to share the land with the Indians. That's sort of the dominant narrative that's taught to the young children, and that is also widely accepted by media as well, as we consider Thanksgiving Day parade, right? As we consider, Macy's sales on Thanksgiving, not necessarily celebrating that sort of interaction, but certainly, that day becomes celebratory, or has become celebratory historically, because of that glorification of that event, which historically never went down like that. And so this is where revisionist history becomes very important. Revisionist history begs us to reconsider romantic notions of the past, given new research that comes from multiple perspectives. So as we've gotten more research, as academia has almost been forced to sort of pay more attention to indigenous peoples telling their own stories, because indigenous peoples have demanded that their stories be heard. Academia's conception of or understanding of Thanksgiving really has changed drastically, so that we better understand now that day never actually happened, that there wasn't necessarily a feast, that if there was sort of interaction or was some sort of celebration, it was actually through fasting. We also know through revisionist history that majority of the people who were coming over in the 1600s were not pilgrims. Pilgrims were actually in the minority. People originally came, or European English settlers originally came in 1607 because they were sort of seeking a business venture. It sort of was about money, and much less about sort of religious freedom. And the first people to sort of come were coming from a very elite class, and were coming to sort of set up another version of England. There was sort of not a lot of investment in creating something that was brand new, as much as it was sort of expanding an empire. And that's how colonization works. Colonization, which is another key word that's important as we consider the revisionist history around Thanksgiving and around indigenous peoples. Colonization, much like folks like Malika and Tabitha and Gustavo sort of said, all three of you sort of use a very important word in thinking about colonization, which is forced assimilation. So that colonization is the forced removal of a people within a land and the forced cultural transplantation within that particular landmass. So that there's also a relationship between a mother country, like England in this case, and a host country, like the early American colonies in this case. And that relationship is based on a particular power dynamic where these colonies have some form of sovereignty, some form of self-rule, but still are under the stipulations and are still under the power and guidance of the mother country. And again, in this case, it would be England, which would be important as we consider the Atlantic slave trade during the 17th and 18th centuries, because as indigenous peoples were essentially being killed off in order to sort of either both make way, but also because they were beginning to resist the people who were taking over their land. We're thinking about how wherever there's oppression, there's always resistance. We're thinking about how this relationship between the early colonies and England was important to think about with the Atlantic slave trade, because of how the Atlantic slave trade was able to then force Africans over into this country as well. And so this is one of the reasons why these three groups, indigenous peoples, European settlers, and Africans and African peoples, are so crucial, their histories are so crucial to really understand, both as individual groups, but then also too as a collective, because of how integral they were to the beginnings of what we would sort of now call the United States. The revisionist history sort of acknowledges colonization as being a very violent beginning. It acknowledges that this violence was also gendered. Oftentimes, we sort of focus on the violence that takes place between men, or the violence that's sort of on men dying, or even women dying. But very rarely does history sort of take into account the violence that is specific to women, which is sexual violence. Dorothy Smith writes a really wonderful book on that in relation to indigenous peoples called Sexual Conquest, and how the systematic raping of women was also a sort of a big part of colonization as well, and sort of dominating not just a land, but dominating peoples also. And so that early history, isn't pretty at all, particularly as we sort of consider how school would then become a place that would continue that cultural genocide. School, the purpose of school was specific for indigenous peoples. European settlers, English settlers specifically, sort of divides school as a way to have them assimilate. That forced assimilation becomes really important there. That was the purpose. There would be sort of other peoples, though, who would take up sort of different forms of education for indigenous peoples as well, so that not all of the interactions were necessarily horrific or violent per se. And not all indigenous peoples, again, sort of, went willingly. There were a few schools that were burnt, or that were sort of destroyed by peoples because they refused. There was definitely resistance on their part. There was definitely conflict there, and in some cases there wasn't. It sort of depended on each given nation.